Hi, fantasy readers. This is Corinne Norton, your fellow book binger, and you are listening to the Finding Fantasy Reads podcast, where you can test out a new fantasy story every single week to find your next favorite author. Today's story has that classic fantasy feel, where you can tell it's a small story from a much bigger world. But instead of being told by a warrior or adventurer, it's told from the perspective of an artist. I absolutely love that it's written by a father-son duo, Dan and Robert Zangari. Dan is the creator of the Legends of Calda fantasy universe, and he's been working on it since the early 1990s. When he's not writing, he enjoys reading, watching movies, spending quality time with family, and serving in his local church congregation. His son, Robert, is the co-author of the various books which belong to the Legends of Calda universe. Outside of writing, he enjoys spending time with his wife and daughters, playing video games, practicing martial arts, and immersing himself in other good stories. Today's narrator is Paeter Frandsen, host of Christian Geek Central. Stick around to the end or check out today's show notes to see where you can find more from both the authors and the narrator, as well as how to enter our giveaway. For now, please enjoy Defender of Stone by Dan and Robert Zangari.
(6492 CD), the city of Tor. Melinar Dolshir was well known for his attention to detail. His meticulous nature was but one of many traits that had earned him his renowned reputation as one of the finest sculptors in the city of Tor. But even when he was a youth, many people claimed Melinar had a natural gift for refining stone. As a young boy, no older than 4 years old, Melinar had discovered his love for chiseling stone when his father built their family's country homestead on the western plains of Soroth, a large island in the Kalishir Ocean. One of Melinar's earliest memories was helping the workers hammer their chisels to shape the home's exterior walls. That was an impressionable moment that would forever shape his life. At some point during his childhood, Melinar didn't know when exactly, he began scouring the fields outside his family's home to find large rocks. Together with his father, Melinar would chisel the rocks, making what his younger self deemed masterpieces of art. His father had kept many of those masterpieces over the years, and some decorated his father's study even to this day. Masterpieces, Melinar thought, laughing and shaking his head. My, how far I've come. He adjusted his grip on a riffler file, a tool used for fine sculpting. He stepped back, studying a true masterpiece towering in the center of his workshop. It was the likeness of one of the Fathers of Freedom, standing over twice the height of an average man. The statue was a representation of Melthos Dolshir, Melinar's grandfather. Melthos's likeness was made from white galstra, a granite-like stone with beige flecks and strata, and stood atop a knee-high pedestal chiseled from the same white stone. It wore exquisitely crafted armor befitting a general of the Western sovereignty. 2 empty scabbards hanging from the statue's waist were also chiseled from the same galstra slab. "Now this is a masterpiece," Melinar said, grinning. The statue stood in a heroic pose, chin lifted, gaze skyward. Melinar imagined his grandfather as bold, stalwart, and tenacious. He wanted to capture those traits, as Melthos Dolshir was one of the greatest heroes of the Western sovereignty. Not only were the statue's expression exhibiting those traits, they were also conveyed in the figure's brawny physique. An uneducated eye might think the statue an exaggeration, but it was quite accurate. Not only had Melinar based his work on paintings, but he knew his father and grandfather shared the same brawny build. In many ways, Melinar felt he was sculpting a likeness of his father, Cornar Dolshir. "The resemblance is uncanny," Melinar mused, and then glanced to a painting upon which he based his sculpture's face. Both Melinar's father and grandfather had the same strong jawline. Their deep-set eyes were the same emerald shade, and their high cheekbones were identical. Still grinning, Melinar returned his focus to the statue. He was nearly finished with the masterpiece. All that remained was completing the detail on one of the scabbards. He had already polished the rest of the statue. With riffler in hand, Melinar returned to the unfinished scabbard. When he was first commissioned by the overseers of historical preservation, they requested that he leave the scabbards empty. Melinar thought that odd. Then they requested that Melinar separately sculpt the weapons meant for those scabbards, a serrated dagger and a short sword. That puzzled Melinar further. After all, this statue of Melthos Dolshir was to stand atop a pillar within the Great Wall of Osselgard, a grand barrier that surrounded the older parts of Tor. There was no place atop the pillar where the stone weapons could be displayed. Melinar deduced that they wanted the stone weapons inside the scabbards. But if the sculpted weapons were laid in the scabbards, their fine detail would undoubtedly break from their own weight and pressure. Despite his concerns, Melinar sculpted the weapons separately as requested. Besides, it wasn't the first time he had replicated them. While Melinar refined the left scabbard, a knock resounded from the side door of the workshop. Melinar glanced to a nearby window, allowing a view to the western parts of the city. Dusk was upon Tor, and the setting sun in the east glistened off the metal rooftops of several buildings. Another knock sounded at the door. "I'm coming!" Melinar shouted, stepping away from the statue. He strode across the workshop, riffler still in hand. As Melinar reached the door, a faint conversation carried through it. He strained to hear the exchange, but the voices were too low. Melinar opened the door, finding a dark-haired woman dressed in a tan-colored lady's tunic and pants. She wore a dark blue cloak and cowl with golden embroidery along its edges that looked like tiny vines and flowers. "That looks Losian," he thought, then eyed a large satchel resting against the woman's waist. The woman pursed her lips and studied Melinar with cold, sea-gray eyes. She didn't look pleased to be standing there. "Your wife said you often don't hear when someone is knocking," the woman said flatly. "That can happen when chiseling stone." She gestured inside the workshop. "May I enter?" Melinar glanced beyond the woman, searching for his wife, Vedina. She was undoubtedly one of the voices he had heard before opening the door, but Vedina wasn't around. "Your wife went back to the house," the woman said, gesturing with her head toward his 3-story home with its steep, peaked roof. Like many artisans in the city of Tor, Melinar's workshop sat behind his residence. His workshop was probably larger than most, since many of his works were quite large. Luckily, the Talar district in which Melinar lived allowed for such accessory buildings. "She said your dinner will be ready soon," the woman said, her tone growing impatient. "I suggest we get on with the delivery." Her hand was still extended toward the door. "Delivery?" Melinar wondered, then glanced again to the embroidery on the blue cloak. Could this be the courier from Aloth? But he wasn't expecting the courier for at least a month. Why would Overseer Balin send word to the mages ahead of my final report? During Melinar's latest report to the Overseers of Historical Preservation, it was mentioned that a courier from Aloth would deliver something to help protect the statue. They didn't explain what, though. Intrigued, Melinar's mind had raced with possibilities. During his schooling at Kasurard, the most prestigious academy for artisans here in Tor, Melinar had heard stories of the pristine statues at the estate of Concorious Knowledge. Many accounts claimed that the statues had withstood the effects of weathering for over 1,000 years. Some people claimed the Tevisrals, devices that channeled magic, were responsible for such preservation. Others said the statues were often repaired by mages using transmutative magic. Melinar thought that unlikely. He had a broader understanding of magic than most people, and he knew that the moment the mage ceased concentrating, the transmutation would crumble. But the use of Tevisrals seemed even more unlikely, as the supreme law of the Kingdom of Los, the nation where Aloth was located, forbade the use of Tevisrals. You're the courier from Aloth? Melinar asked. The woman rolled her eyes. Isn't that obvious? She demanded. Now, are you going to let me in or not? Melinar stepped aside, and the woman entered, now shaking her head. As he closed the door, the courier stepped across the workshop and studied the statue. Very impressive, she said. A befitting likeness for a Mistralim. A what? Melinar wondered, following the woman. She continued talking to herself, using strange words Melinar had never heard as she moved to a nearby work table holding several tools, mallets of varying sizes, fine-point chisels, rasps, rifflers, and polishing cloths. The woman studied the table, then disappointedly turned back to Melinar. Do you have someplace that is clutter-free? She asked, gesturing to the work table. Yes, Melinar replied, pointing beyond the statue. There's a spot along the far wall. The courier moved ahead of Melinar, rounding the statue. Once at the table, she set her large satchel upon it, then studied one of the reference paintings. At first glance, one might think you egocentric, she said, as Melinar joined her. But I must admit, you do look like him. You're too young to be his son. A grandson, perhaps? Melinar nodded with a chuckle. Most people think I look like my father, he said. And my father looks like his father. Overseer Balin claimed that as one of the reasons they wanted to commission me. They thought I might have an easier time than another when sculpting my grandfather's likeness. After all, I can draw inspiration from myself and my father. How fitting, she said with a grunt, then opened her satchel, revealing several glistening spheres. Melinar bent toward the satchel, gazing at the spheres. Those weren't Tevisrals, were they? They couldn't be, he thought. An Alothian wouldn't violate their nation's supreme law. I suppose you weren't told what these are, the courier said, lifting one of the spheres from the satchel. Melinar shook his head. That is well, she said with a grin. The sphere was palm-sized and transparent, with tiny glistening specks. A thin golden frame encased the sphere, dividing it into thirds. Tiny inscriptions were scrawled all along the golden frame, but he could see that they were not the written characters of the common tongue. Where are the weapons you sculpted? She asked, grabbing an identical sphere. Wait, Melinar said, stepping between her and the path that led to the sculpted weapons. Before you do anything else, I need to understand what is going on. The overseers didn't mention anything about additions to my work. The courier looked even more displeased than when she was at the door. You wouldn't understand, she said, her tone condescending. Now please step aside and give me access to the weapons. If you add those to the weapons, they won't be accurate, Melinar said. You'll be destroying the aesthetics of its authenticity. Besides, the gem in the serrated dagger's pommel is triangular, not round. Step aside, she insisted, and show me to the weapons. Reluctantly, Melinar moved farther along the wall. He stopped at a solid table where the two oversized stone weapons lay. Impressive, she murmured. Most impressive. The courier said something else that Melinar didn't quite understand, but he thought she was remarking about the weapons' resemblance to their real-world counterparts. How could she know what they looked like? He wondered. The overseers hadn't had any accurate depictions of Melthos Dolshir's weapons. Not many people were acquainted with them. Melinar's father had inherited the weapons after Melthos died, and then shortly thereafter relocated to Soroth. Melinar himself, however, was well acquainted with the stone weapons' real-world counterparts. Melinar's father had taught him how to wield both weapons, and when Melinar was 13, he had made replicas of them, from stone, of course. But those replicas were not nearly as impressive as what lay on the table. Both stone weapons were 2.5 times larger than the real weapons, and perfect replicas. Shortly after accepting the commission, Melinar asked his father to bring the weapons to Tor so he could take accurate measurements. The actual serrated dagger and short sword were shorter than a man's arm. The blades were barely the length of a forearm, but the stone replicas, if standing on end, would reach to a man's chest. In fact, The short sword looked like a thick claymore. "What exquisite detail!" The courier's tone had changed from condescending impatience to awed admiration. "The blade's edges look so sharp. That is good." She moved the sphere in her left hand toward the serrated dagger's hilt. "As you can see, it won't fit," Melinar said, pointing to the triangular indentation carved in the pommel. It was not quite half the size of the sphere. "It is unwise to place a thorindar in the pommel," the courier said. "A what?" Melinar asked. "For best results, the optimal place is within the hilt, near the guard." She glided the sphere along the stone weapon's hilt. The sphere was half the size of the hilt's thickness. "Here," she said, hovering the sphere near the dagger's sinuous guard. "So, what are you saying?" Melinar asked, watching the courier ease the sphere toward the stone. "You want me to chisel a hole in the hilt? That will weaken the integrity of the stone. It will—" White light burst from the point where the sphere touched the stone weapon. The light grew brighter. Melinar shielded his eyes, squinting against the light. He could barely see the outlines of the courier pushing the sphere into the stone. Impossible. Soon the light ceased. Melinar blinked several times, then noticed that the sphere in the courier's left hand was gone. It was as if the sphere had gone into the stone. But how was that possible? Unfazed, the courier moved toward the large stony hilt of the sculpted short sword. As with the serrated dagger, she guided the other sphere toward the guard and pressed it into the stone. More blinding light filled the workshop, but dissipated after a moment. Melinar searched the courier's hand, but the second sphere had vanished like the first. "By Heleron's trident," he cursed. The courier turned toward him nonchalantly. "Am I safe in assuming you aren't finished with the statue?" She spoke as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Melinar struggled to speak, and all he could do was nod. "All right," the courier said and sighed, walking back to her satchel. "Come with me." Mystified, Melinar watched the woman reach into her satchel once more. "Well, don't just stand there," she said petulantly, removing another sphere from the satchel. This sphere was larger than the first two, about half the size of a man's head. "I have other important things that need doing." Gathering his wits, Melinar walked back to the courier. "Once you are finished, put this in the statue's chest, or anywhere else in its torso. This sphere," she emphasized, "needs to be in a centralized location in order for everything to work properly." The courier eyed the tabletop, then glanced back to Melinar. "This isn't made out of stone, is it?" Melinar shook his head. "Good," she said, setting the large sphere atop the table. "Don't let it touch stone, unless you're putting it in the statue, of course. Now this," she rummaged through her satchel, "needs to go into the pedestal." She removed a large disc the size of a dinner plate, with the thickness of a hefty tome, and set it next to the sphere. Unlike the sphere, the disc was made mostly of a strange, glistening white metal. Several transparent lines wrapped around its circumference. More strange characters were engraved on the metal parts of the disc, glowing a faint blue. "The same goes for this." She tapped the disc. "Don't let it touch any stone other than the pedestal. It must be placed last, do you understand?" Melinar nodded. The courier closed her satchel and slung it over her shoulder. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I must take my leave. Keep up the good work, Mr. Dulcier. I'm sure our paths will cross again." With that, the courier hurried out of the workshop, leaving the door ajar. Dumbfounded, Melinar stared at the strange objects on the table. These couldn't be Tevisrals. Although he had heard plenty of tales from his father, they were unlike any Tevisral Melinar knew of. But the disc was glowing, and when objects glowed, it often meant magic flowed through them. Why would they put Tevisrals inside a statue? Melinar wondered. It didn't make any sense to him. Shaking off his perplexity, Melinar returned to the unfinished scabbard. The courier's warnings repeated in his mind as he worked. Soon, Only the light stone lanterns lit the workshop. He worked until he was satisfied with the detailing on the scabbard. He ran his fingers across the scabbard's stony surface, studying the curve to make sure it was consistent. Good, he thought. Now all that was required was polishing. As Melinar placed the riffler on his work table, the side door to his workshop opened. I take it you're not hungry, his wife said, her tone not amused. Dinner, he bemoaned, guilt welling in his throat. Vedina stood in the doorway. Curly, sandy blonde hair hung down to her folded arms. Her thin lips were pursed, and her pale brown eyes stared at him questioningly. The children and I have already finished, she said. She sighed once before continuing. I know you're almost finished with this statue, but I think you should pace yourself. If you work too hard, you'll only burn yourself out. Melinar stared at her, blinking several times. How had he forgotten about dinner? Was he in shock over the incident with the weapons? Those questions gave him pause. Are you all right? Vedina asked. No, Melinar muttered, reaching toward a polishing cloth. Vedina's demeanor softened, and she stepped into the workshop. Concerned, she caressed Melinar's shoulder. What happened? Unsure of what to say, Melinar did his best to describe the incident with the courier. To his surprise, Vedina hadn't seen the bursts of light, even though many of the windows along the home's rear had a view of the workshop and its nearest window. Perhaps she had been in a different part of the house. Intrigued by Melinar's tale, Vedina eyed the table with the sphere and disc. They must be Tevisrals, she said. But why? Why would someone from Alaf hide Tevisrals inside this statue? Though he had wondered the same, hearing the question only made Melinar wary of the answer. I think you've had enough excitement for one day, Vedina said. Come inside. You can resume in the morning. The following day, Melinar finished polishing the scabbard. Vedina watched him closely, curious to see the strange occurrence he had told her about the previous night. She had sent the children to a friend's house, concerned that something might happen when Melinar placed the strange objects inside the stone. Vedina always worried about things that were strange and unusual. After putting away his polishing cloth, Melinar grabbed the large sphere. Ever cautious, he picked his way through his workshop, warily eyeing his wife as he approached her. Be careful, Vedina nervously bit her lip. Melinar nodded, making his way to a ladder in front of the statue. Wait, Vedina called, coming beside him. Let me hold that while you climb. Melinar held out the sphere. While Vedina reached for it, a creaking noise and a bang carried into the workshop, and she flinched. Melinar lost his grip, dropping the sphere. No. Don't let it touch any stone, the warning rang in Melinar's mind. Panicked, he lunged toward the sphere as it fell toward the stone floor. Vedina whirled, gasping. As the sphere neared the floor, Melinar managed to grab it, but landed on his stomach. His fingers grazed the floor, and the sphere nearly collided with his work table. I'm sorry, Vedina squeaked, her voice several octaves higher than usual. Melinar breathed deeply, easing onto his knees and elbows. Vedina began muttering anxiously, but Melinar's heart was thumping so hard that he couldn't quite understand her. Besides, her voice was still abnormally high. And you know how easily I get distracted when I'm worried. I shouldn't have... It's fine, Melinar interrupted. I should have held my grip. Come help me, please. She hurried beside him and grabbed the sphere. Vedina bit her lip again, her expression still anxious. After Melinar stood, they exchanged tense gazes for a moment. Once they relaxed, as much as they could, Melinar resumed the task of setting the sphere and disc. He moved a stepping stool toward the ladder and reached for the sphere. Vedina handed it back, took a deep breath, and climbed the stool. Once she was atop it, Melinar eased the sphere back into her hands. He watched her for a moment, then climbed the ladder. The statue's chest was nearly twice as high as Melinar was tall. Eye level with the breastplate, Melinar turned to his wife, reaching toward her. Nervously, she handed Melinar the sphere, letting out a long breath as he took it. With the sphere in hand, Melinar studied the stone breastplate. He eased the sphere toward the stone, heart thumping. Though he knew a blinding flash would accompany the sphere's touch, he kept his eyes wide open. Melinar sucked in his breath as stone and sphere met. Blinding light erupted from the sphere, and Vedina screamed. Amid her shriek, Melinar shut his eyes and felt a tingling sensation along his hands and fingers, like 1,000 needles gently pricking his flesh. Suddenly, his hands were pushed away and he felt the sphere no longer. Soon, the light faded. The sphere was gone. Easing against the ladder, Melinar studied the spot where the sphere had touched the stone. There was no sign of it. "By all the gods of Kalda," Vedina muttered. Now for the disc, Melinar thought, climbing down the ladder. As he reached the table where the courier had placed the strange objects, Melinar noticed that the engraved characters on the disc were glowing a pale green instead of blue. Odd, he thought, grabbing the disc. Melinar returned to the statue. Vedina had moved the stool and ladder, giving him clear access to the pedestal between the statue's legs. "What do you think is going to happen?" Vedina asked. Though Melinar had his back to her, he knew she was biting her lip. "The same thing," he said, bending toward the stone pedestal. Melinar eased the disc onto the stone, bracing himself for the blinding flash, but nothing happened. Confused, Melinar stepped back, stopping beside his wife. They watched the disc for a moment, then glanced to each other. "Maybe you have to touch those glowing spots?" Vedina speculated. Melinar shrugged, then noticed the pale green hue had changed to vibrant orange. Then the stone around the edges of the disc liquefied. The disc sank into the stone as if through mud. Once it disappeared completely, the stone settled, like a stilling pond, and then solidified. "Now what?" Vedina asked, studying her husband. "How would I know?" He pursed his lips and studied the statue of his grandfather. Nothing had changed. "You said the overseers were bringing something to protect the statue, right?" Vedina asked. "Yes." "Well, maybe it's protected. Maybe that disc thing is able to use transmutative magic or something. Why don't you try polishing off an edge?" Intrigued, Melinar grabbed one of his polishing cloths and moved to the pedestal. The statue was exactly as he wanted, and he didn't want to ruin it by testing a theory. So he ran the polishing cloth back and forth across the edge of the pedestal several times, expecting to find dust-like debris. He found nothing. Odd, he thought. "Use a riffler," Vedina suggested. Melinar narrowed his eyes at his wife, and she made several insistent gestures. Reluctantly, he grabbed one of his rifflers and moved to the back of the pedestal. At least that part wouldn't show. He grated along the edge, but no debris came loose. "Well?" Vedina asked. "Nothing." "Nothing?" she blurted, moving around the statue. She furrowed her brow, her bewilderment painfully obvious. "Well, it's definitely protected," Melinar said with a sigh. He picked his way past his wife to return the riffler to the work table. "I'm going to rest." Shrill screams awoke Melinar. He tossed aside a thin blanket, leaping from the sofa where he had fallen asleep. Frantic cries echoed through the house, undoubtedly Vedina's. "What now?" Melinar thought, rounding the corner and dashing into the kitchen. Vedina was against the wall opposite the window that overlooked the rear yard and the workshop. With a trembling hand, she pointed to the workshop, frantically screeching incoherent nonsense. It, she muttered, shaking her head. "It?" Melinar wondered. Was she referring to the statue? When at the kitchen window, one could see into the workshop through its nearest window. It moved!" Vedina swallowed hard. "The statue moved?" Melinar glanced out the window, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. "What do you mean, it moved?" Vedina continued shaking her head. Perhaps she saw something else moving, he thought. darting to the home's rear entrance. He kept a sheathed sword near the door, not that this particular part of Tor was prone to crime. Melinar was his father's son, and that meant having a weapon handy to defend his family. With sword in hand, Melinar bolted through the door, searching the yard. All was quiet. Nothing, he thought. The bushes and trees bordering the property were still. After determining that the yard was safe, Melinar hurried to his workshop. The door was closed and locked just as he had left it. Melinar unlocked the door and hurried inside. He started upon seeing the statue. Melthos Dolshir's likeness was not at all how Melinar had left it. The statue had moved, and the stone weapons were inside the once empty scabbards. "By Heleron's fins and scales," Melinar cursed, shaking his head. How had the statue moved? And the weapons, each weighed so much that one alone required 5 men to move it. He cautiously picked his way toward the statue. No longer was it gazing skyward. Instead, its head was tilted toward the door, and the expression on its face was no longer stoic. Impossible. As Melinar came within arm's reach of the statue, the workshop's door burst open. He spun, finding Vedina leaning against the doorframe. Don't you see it?" Melinar nodded. "I do, but there's no way stone can move." Vedina's eyes widened, and she staggered backward as a booming voice spoke from behind Melinar. "I would disagree with that assertion." Melinar spun, drawing the sword from its sheath. Instinctively, he dropped into a battle stance, one of many his father had taught him. He frantically searched the workshop, but saw no one, and then Melinar saw the impossible. The statue's stony legs shifted. Melinar redirected his gaze, finding the statue of his grandfather staring directly at him, a broad smile forming across the stony visage. "Don't be afraid," the statue said with that booming voice. "I won't hurt you. My name is Melthos Dolshir." Though the words were deep, there was something soothing to them. Vedina stammered, finally asking, "How is that possible?" The statue's face shifted as if pondering the question. Melinar, however, gawked at the now living statue. A moment of silence passed before the statue spoke. "That is a complicated answer." Melinar stuttered. "You can't be Melthos Dolshir. He's dead." "I assumed as much," the statue said, frowning. "The last thing I can recall is my preparations to go to Leyland Lake. The siege must not have gone well." The door slammed shut, and Melinar glanced over his shoulder. His wife crept through the workshop, her face contorted with fear and intrigue. She soon came beside Melinar, tightly gripping his arm. "Please," the statue continued, "don't be afraid. I know I am now a hunk of rock, but I promise I am gentle." What are you?" Vedina muttered. The statue grinned once again, nodding his head. "I don't know what they're called in common, but the Lords of Metal call them Mistralim. I am an embodiment of consciousness preserved by a combination of very ancient Tevisrals." The statue paused for a moment, averting his gaze. "I never thought I would be immortalized like this." Melinar and Vedina stared at each other in disbelief. A living, immortal statue? And one that was once a man? But not just any man. Melinar's grandfather. The statue cleared its throat, then spoke once again. "Now that you know who I am, it's only fitting you tell me who you are. I assume you are the man who sculpted me, or rather this body." What could he say? Melinar stood in silence for a moment. "I understand," the statue said. "This is all a lot to take in, and—" "My name is Melinar Dolshir. I am a sculptor here in the city of Tor." The statue's eyes widened, and it reared back. "It really is alive," Melinar mused. For a short while the statue looked troubled. "I am afraid to ask how long it has been since my last memory. It studied Melinar for a moment. Am I safe to assume that you are my descendant? Melinar nodded. Your grandson. The statue looked relieved. The emotion on the stony visage was unsettling. Then it's not been too long, the statue said. How are my children, Kor and little Galana? He spoke as if referencing young children. They are well, I suppose, Melinar answered. Father is retired, and Aunt Galana keeps herself busy by taking care of her mother-in-law. Galana was always thoughtful, the statue said softly, its stony face looking as if it wanted to cry, but stone could not shed tears. Are they nearby? The statue asked. I would like to see them before I embrace my fate. They're not here, Vedina said. They live in Soroth. Soroth? The statue asked, sounding disgusted. Melinar suddenly remembered his grandfather's prejudice toward the Mindolarn Empire and their allies. After all, they had subjugated Tor and the entire Western sovereignty through a bloody war. But times were different now. Not many nations allied themselves to Mindolarn as they once had. Vedina ventured an explanation, but Melinar interrupted her. What do you mean by your fate? He asked. The statue turned toward Melinar. Mithrilims are the undying protectors of the most sacred things on Kalda. Whoever commissioned you to create my likeness wants me to protect something. The statue then reached for his weapons, drawing them from their scabbards. At the statue's touch, both weapons transformed. What was once stone was now glistening metal. Both weapons looked identical to their real-world counterparts, to the minutest detail. Even the stone depicting the gems in the pommels was transformed. Oh! Vedina gasped, abruptly raising a hand to her lips. Amazing, Melinar thought, staring at the now metallic weapons. Quite incredible, I must say, the statue said, sounding intrigued. I've never seen such transformations. I wonder. The statue furrowed its brow, then the weapon burst with vibrant fire. The flames were undoubtedly magical in nature. I am destined to protect something, it mused. But you are to be placed atop the Great Wall of Osselgard, Melinar said. There's nothing sacred there, is there? The statue simply sheathed its weapons. The flames vanished, and the weapons returned to stone. Vedina quickly resumed her explanation, and soon Melinar joined her. The statue had many questions, as was to be expected. They spoke for hours, and Melinar did his best to recount his father's and his aunt's lives. A knock drew Melinar from the conversation with the statue of his grandfather. Melinar, Vedina said you were in here. May I enter? Though the door muffled the voice, Melinar knew it was Overseer Balin. Why was she here? Had the courier notified her and the others of the delivery? One moment, Melinar hollered, then glanced back to the statue. Melthos's stony visage had resumed its original pose, and the weapons had returned to their scabbards. The sight of the statue resuming its stoic demeanor pleased Melinar. He had captured his grandfather's character. The door creaked open, and a mature woman with gray-streaked, light brown hair entered the workshop. She was short and slender. Her face was wrinkled, but was probably once beautiful. I am impressed, Melinar, she said, gazing at the stilled statue. This is the epitome of grandeur, but I wouldn't expect any less after 2 years of hard work. Thank you, Overseer, Melinar bowed. Balin picked her way across the shop, stopping beside the statue and its pedestal. She skimmed her aged fingers across the cool stone, nodding. This will do nicely. The Overseer then turned toward Melinar. You have crafted a beacon of remembrance. Do you think you can make another? Another statue of my grandfather. Not of Melthos, Balin said. We wish to have other statues commissioned, the rest of the Fathers of Freedom, starting with Candish Lush. Would you be interested, Melinar? Melinar couldn't help but think of what the request implied. Would he be crafting bodies for more Mithralim, as Melthos's statue had called them? I would be honored, Melinar said. Very well, Balin smiled, then marched to the door. The council will want to meet, especially since this statue is finished. You'll be receiving a summons shortly. With that, Overseer Balin strode out of the workshop. Smiling, Melinar closed the door. Not only would he be known for his exquisite details, but Melinar would be the man who would bring forgotten heroes back from the grave.
I hope you enjoyed listening to Defender of Stone by Dan and Robert Zangari, narrated by Paeter Frandsen of Christian Geek Central. If you want to read more by Dan and Robert, go to legendsofkalda.com to find more of their books. If you join their newsletter, you can grab a free copy of Beneath the Frozen Wastes, and you can find more untold tales of Kalda stories like Defender of Stone by purchasing copies at their website under Books in the Untold Tales of Kalda section. If you enjoyed listening to Paeter narrate the story, you might also enjoy listening to his podcast, Christian Geek Central, where he discusses movies, video games, and all things enjoyed by self-proclaimed geeks from a Christian worldview. Don't forget about the Dragon audiobook giveaway with audiobooks from J.A. Andrews, M.L. Spencer, Lindsay Buroker, and Quenby Olson. You can enter at findingfantasyreads.com/giveaway. When's the last time you told someone about the podcast? If it's been a while, I challenge you to think of 2 people in your life who could benefit from listening to the podcast. They'll thank you for it later, and I'll go ahead and thank you now. Thank you, my friend, for sharing the podcast with your friends. In fact, let's do a fun little game. If you take me up on that challenge, send me an email telling me which 2 people you shared the podcast with, like maybe your cousin or a friend in your Facebook reader group. Doesn't have to have their name. Whether or not they listen, because realistically, I'll have no idea. This is the honor system here. I'll send you a code for my audiobook, The Light That Saves, for free. It's a novella I just released yesterday that expands on a story told in Blood of the Stars, and while it has more context if you've read Blood of the Stars, it still functions as a standalone. And if your friend wants that same audiobook, tell them to send me an email that they started listening because you shared the podcast with them, and they can get it for free too. Guys, this is not a well-planned game or reward system. It's an experiment, and we'll see how it turns out, and I may never do it again if it doesn't turn out well. So I suggest you take advantage of it now. I will honor this offer through the end of September, so start inviting people to check out the podcast. Okay, that's enough blabbering. You all know the links are in the show notes, including my email, so you can get credit for spreading the word. Thank you all for listening, and happy reading.